Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Wednesday Night Bible Class. I hope that you have had an amazing week. Here it is dark and gloomy and raining, so I have incorporated some extra lighting, hoping that will help the situation. In today's class, we are going to look at the exiles who have returned home from Babylon. What kinds of situations did they encounter when they got home? Because as we know, there were people in Judah when they came back. There were the Judeans who stayed there. There were people who migrated from different areas. There were also people who resettled the land because they had been conquered. And as we know, Assyria had a policy of conquering a land and scattering the people. So who was in the land when the Israelites come back from exile? And how did they get along with those groups that were in the land? The temple was destroyed, so what did they do? How did they worship? We're going to look at all of that in today's class. Let's get right into it.
In the exilic period, we watched Israel and then Judah navigate their way through two empires that sought and ultimately achieved control over the western states in the Levant. Assyria brought an end to the northern kingdom of Israel in 722, and Babylonia conquered Judah and deported a portion of the population to Babylonia in 586 BCE. Cyrus, the king of Persia, reigned from 559 to 530 BCE and conquered Babylonia in 539, ushering in what is known as the Persian period. This empire endures for 2 centuries until 332 BCE. The Persian period in ancient Near Eastern history is known as the period of restoration and rebuilding in the biblical story. In this period, when some of the exiles in Babylonia return to Judah, 2 issues emerge in the context of rebuilding a community and the temple in Jerusalem. The first issue is who belongs. We could say that this is an early formation of the question, who is a Jew? The returning exiles encounter existing inhabitants of the land, and tensions over national and religious identity become central concerns. The second issue is the elevation of the Mosaic Torah to the authoritative law of the land and the national charter for a reconstituted Judah. We will examine both of these issues in this lecture. The sources that we have for this period are quite numerous. Our biblical sources include Ezra and Nehemiah, which is a 2-volume historical work, and the prophetic books of Haggai and Zechariah. We also have Babylonian, Persian, and Greek sources. These sources talk about the historical period, but they do not focus on the tiny kingdom of Judah. The biblical sources describe the return of some of the Babylonian exiles to Judah under a Persian-sponsored policy of repatriation and rebuilding. The book of Ezra begins announcing this return in the form of quoting some sort of imperial decree. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia. In this introduction, we note that the author of Ezra, like the prophet 2nd Isaiah, understands the rule of the Persian Cyrus to be under the guidance of the Israelite God for the benefit of his chosen people Israel. We then read what is presented as an edict from the Persian king. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, May his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. According to this quoted edict, Cyrus understood his power over all the kingdoms of the earth to have come from the Israelite God, and it is Cyrus himself who wishes to rebuild this God's temple in Jerusalem. At the same time, he's addressing the Judeans in exile as this God's chosen people, and he locates the home of this God in the city of Jerusalem. We do, however, have independent Persian evidence for the policy of repatriating conquered peoples and sponsoring the rebuilding of local shrines and temples.
We love the archaeology.
The most important document in this regard is known as the Cyrus Cylinder. This clay cylinder is inscribed with cuneiform text in the Akkadian language of the Babylonians. In it, Cyrus, the recent conqueror of Babylonia, claims that the Babylonian high god Marduk had blessed and rejoiced in his victory over Babylonia. He accuses the defeated king of Babylonia, Nabonidus, of not properly worshiping Marduk, and because of this, Marduk was angry and brought Cyrus to Babylonia in order to remove Nabonidus. The biblical record remembers this conquest as something that their own God arranged, not to avenge Marduk, but to punish the Babylonians and make the return of the exiles to Judah possible.
So here we have a situation where the Israelites are recording in their history that God is the one who touched Cyrus's heart, and this is why Cyrus decided to let the Israelites go back home. And then we have Cyrus in his cylinder recording that the Persian god Marduk is the one who allowed him to conquer Babylon, and so there are two conflicting gods here, right? One of the ways I like to sort of analyze this kind of thing in my mind is when you see that there are other groups of people and they have these gods, right? We already know that. We already know the other group had their own gods. Whose God is still around, though? Like, and when I say whose God is still around, I in no way believe in any other God other than God. But they did. But you don't hear anybody talking about these ancient gods, right, anymore. There's just God. And that's because there was always just God. And so people had their gods that they created, they made up, but they never existed. So when we see stuff like this in history where another group is talking about their God, we know that it's made up. I mean, if it wasn't, that God would still be around, like God is. So this is how I like to look at it when I look at ancient history and see that other people had their small g gods. They don't exist anymore. When you think about it, only God exists. Only God has ever existed.
The cylinder text contains additional important information. It quotes Cyrus saying, "I gathered together all their inhabitants." Here he's referring to exiled people living in various cities within the Babylonian Empire. He gathered these inhabitants and restored them to their dwellings. The text also claims that Cyrus took the gods of Sumer and Akkad, the gods of the Babylonians, and returned them to their appropriate temples. Cyrus repatriated conquered people and sponsored the rebuilding of local temples, and he presented himself as the servant of the gods whose people he now controlled. The return to Jerusalem was not a one-time massive transplantation of an entire exiled population. Instead, it appears that there were several waves of returning exiles that spanned over 100 years of history. And even with these waves of returnees, there's clear evidence that a majority of exiled Judeans chose to remain in Babylonia, where they had put down roots and adapted to this new culture. So who returned? Ezra indicates that Cyrus's decree allowed any Judean who wanted to return to Judah. In the end, however, we read that only those whose spirits were stirred by God chose to return. Those who did not return are said to have helped the returnees with money and livestock. And Cyrus gave the returning Judeans the vessels of the house of the Lord so they could carry them back to Jerusalem. Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah, possibly the son of the exiled Davidic king Jehoiakim, led the first group back to Judah in around 539 BCE. Other important figures that the book of Ezra links with this first group of returnees included Zerubbabel, an heir to the Davidic throne, and Jeshua, a priest. Nehemiah, a Judean official in the court of a later Persian king, Artaxerxes, returned as governor of Judah in the late 5th century. And still another group came even later under the leadership of a priest named Ezra. The 2-volume history known as Ezra-Nehemiah focuses on 2 major events: the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and the establishment of the Torah as the law of the land. While Ezra-Nehemiah privileges the viewpoint of those who returned from exile over those who had remained in Judah, we can nonetheless piece together several factions within this reconstituted Judah that did not agree on who should control the rebuilding of the temple and on who should control the law of the land. In short, they did not agree on who belonged in the new Israel. The first act of those who returned to Judah from exile was to make offerings on the ruined mount of the former temple. Then, after 7 months, Ezra reports that the returnees gathered again as one man to Jerusalem. The first 2 stages in building were erecting an altar so that sacrifices could resume, and then laying the foundation for the new temple. In both of these events, we hear evidence for discord within the community. Those who returned from exile viewed themselves as the new Israel. They had earned this designation because they saw exile as a divine punishment that they had endured, a test that they had passed. And now, having served their time in exile, the Israelite God had brought their suffering to an end and had gathered them back to Jerusalem. This group of returnees also had the advantage of imperial backing from Persia and financial support from the exilic community that had remained in Babylonia. In the process of erecting the new altar and laying the new foundations, we meet several other groups of people. One group is labeled the people or peoples of the land. This group first appears when Jeshua the priest and Zerubbabel, the Davidic heir, build an altar on the site of the former temple. The text then reports that they immediately rushed to make offerings to their God because they feared a group called the people of the land. Later, when the building of the temple had begun in earnest, this same group emerges in an adversarial context. The people of the land discouraged those who were rebuilding the temple and tried to frustrate their purpose.
Is this Sanballat? Is this the story of Sanballat? Have y'all ever heard of, back in the day, let's go to Ezra Nehemiah. Some friends of mine in school were studying to be preachers or ministers, and they used to joke around with each other, and we all used to joke with each other, and and we used to name call with each other as well. One of the names that they used to call each other and me sometimes was Sanballat. And back then I didn't understand why, but I think that Sanballat was a hater. So let's go look at that real quick. Okay. So in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. Why? Then if we go over to Nehemiah chapter 4, but it so happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall. Okay, so Nehemiah is written in the first person by Nehemiah. So when it says, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding, he's telling this story in the first person. But it so happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall that he was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren in the army of Samaria and said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned?" Unbelievable. Verse 7. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry, and all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. So Sanballat was a hater. Sanballat was a hater, and that's why my friends used to call each other Sanballat. To see that come up now is just a little bit nostalgic for me. Sorry about that.
Another group that is presented in opposition to the returning exiles is called the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin. This group appears on the Temple Mount as building is getting underway, and they ask, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days that Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, brought us here." The group identifies themselves as worshipers of the Israelite God. They want to participate in rebuilding the temple, and they indicate that while the exiles have been in Babylonia, this group has continued offering sacrifices to the Israelite God. These worshipers of the Israelite God are quoted identifying themselves as foreigners who were resettled in the northern kingdom of Israel after the Assyrian conquest. We know that the Assyrian policy of deportation did involve the resettling of one conquered people in the territory of another. Another group that had not gone into exile is said to have successfully sabotaged the rebuilding of the temple by sending a letter to the Persian authorities accusing those who had returned of sedition. There is even some evidence for division among those who returned from Babylonia. There seems to be a dispute over who would exercise authority in the newly rebuilt province of Yehud, the Davidic royal heir who bears the title of governor, or the high priest. Ultimately, priestly authority will win out over royal. But during this early period of Persian control, the issue of leadership is debated within the community of returned exiles. Even though it's difficult to tease out of our sources a precise chronology for each of the events and people that we meet in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, this ongoing report of social tensions among the inhabitants of Judah likely reflects the genuine confusion that came with resettling a population in a land and among a people that had gotten used to not having them around. Even the ambiguity of the labels for the various factions reflects this period of transition. When we read labels like people of the land, the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem, adversaries of Judah and Benjamin, we don't know exactly who they refer to. And this is because old labels like Judean or Israelite are no longer clear, and new labels have not yet been agreed upon. All of this suggests a society in flux. After several delays, the newly rebuilt temple reaches completion in around 515 BCE, more than 20 years after the first group had returned from Babylonia and erected an altar. The priests and Levites were installed as officiants in the new temple, and they offered sacrifices of thanksgiving at the completion of the temple. Then the returned exiles celebrated the Passover. In this case, however, some of those who had remained in Judah joined those who had returned from exile in celebrating this feast. But the language reflecting internal divisions remains, as this joining group is described as having separated themselves from the pollutions of the peoples of the land. We also hear generational differences among those who had returned from Babylonia. Already, when the foundation was laid for the new temple, those old people among the returnees who could remember the first temple were said to weep because this new temple did not have the grandeur of the first. The new generation, the one that was born in exile, that had never seen the first temple, shouted for joy. The multiple waves of returning exiles to Judah clearly upset the balance of power that had existed in Judah for more than 50 years. The people of the land described as polluted are likely the Judeans that did not go into exile. The poor, the non-elite, the illiterate, they had nonetheless made a life for themselves on the land, and in some cases on the specific land plots that had once been the family inheritance of those who were in exile. Those Yahweh worshipers that Ezra labels opponents of Benjamin and Judah could be Israelites from the north who had fled south to Judah to live. There also would have been many foreign groups living in Judah and in the territories that may at one time have been part of Judah. These would include Moabites, Ammonites, descendants of the Philistines, and Edomites. The returnees themselves, some literate, some priestly, some Davidic, some noble, all of them land claiming, imperially sponsored, and decently financed. They clearly represented a threat to those who were already in the land. And for those returnees, those in the land represented an obstacle to creating a purified, restored, temple-centered community, worthy of the covenant with their God. It's within this context of a reconstituted Judah that Ezra and Nehemiah raise the issue of intermarriage with foreigners. Ezra is described as coming from a priestly family and as a scribe skilled in the law of Moses. Ezra claims imperial authority to require the observance of the law of the God of heaven, a law which is later clarified as the law of Moses. When Ezra arrives in Judah, likely around 458, he learns that the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land with their abominations. Specifically, they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race has mixed itself with the peoples of the land. The group being singled out here as the people of Israel is likely the community of returnees that has now been back in Judah for upwards of 50 years. They are called the people of Israel because the returning Judeans took up the mantle of all Israel. Now Ezra, tending a bit toward the melodramatic, rends his garments, yanks out his hair from his head and his beard, and sits down appalled. He then prays, asking forgiveness for the sins of this preserved remnant from exile, forgiveness for the sin of intermarrying with foreigners. The people then make a covenant with God before Ezra and promise to put away all these foreign wives and their children. The book of Ezra closes with a decree throughout the land of Judah for all the returnees to put aside their foreign wives and to remain separate from the people of the land. Nehemiah served as governor of Judah during the same time period as Ezra, and much of the material about intermarriage from the book of Ezra is repeated in the book of Nehemiah. While it seems very unlikely that the oath of all the Israelite men to put aside their foreign wives and their children was ever carried out on some grand scale, the issue of intermarriage and even mixing with others was clearly important to the community of returned exiles. They had managed to maintain their Judean identity as worshippers of the Israelite God while in Babylonia. And now they found upon returning to Judah that those who had stayed in the land did not share the same sense of national identity and boundary marking. Intermarriage with foreigners was simply one place to mark a boundary that gave the returnees a sense of preserved identity. A second focal point for the restored and reconstituted Judean community is the temple and the Torah of Moses. This doesn't happen overnight. Rather, it likely occurs across generations. But in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, this lengthy transition to a Torah-centered community is sacralized in a single remembered event: Ezra's public reading of the Torah. We know that Ezra is introduced as one who had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it and to teach his statutes and ordinances in Israel. We then learn that Ezra gathered all the people of Israel from their towns to Jerusalem in the 7th month. He stood raised on a wooden platform or pulpit, flanked by laity and Levites, and he opened the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. Again, the historicity of the exact details of this event described here is less important than what this story tells us about the place of the Torah in a reconstituted Judah. When Ezra opened the Torah, we read that all the people stood, clearly suggesting that the authority and authenticity of this book was recognized by what we're calling all Israel. Ezra then leads a kind of liturgy. He blesses the Lord his God, and the people respond, Amen, Amen, lifting up their hands, bowing their heads, worshiping their God, whom they understand to be in some way present in this gathering around his Torah. We then get a window into the evolving role of the Levites. Prior to the exile, when the first temple stood, the Levites were landless, sometimes described as wandering. They served in the Jerusalem temple in positions below the priests, but we also hear of them serving in the outlying shrines. During the Second Temple period, the Levites are still considered of lower status than the priests, but they take on a new role that will prove crucial in the development of Judaism as a non-temple focused religion.
And I wonder if that's because the Levites would interpret the Torah to the people. Because remember, back in exile, they were there for about 70 years. And so the people who went into exile knew the Hebrew language, but the people who were growing up in exile and were born in exile, they began to lose the Hebrew language and speak Aramaic, which was the language of Babylon. And so when they come back, Aramaic is the language. What I wonder is if those Levites are interpreting the Torah, which is written in Hebrew, to Aramaic because the people are now speaking Aramaic.
While Ezra the priest presents the Torah and reads from it from morning till afternoon, the Levites are described as helping the people understand the law. They gave sense to the law. We have to remember that the Torah was in Hebrew, and many of the people gathered would no longer speak or understand Hebrew. The spoken language of the time was Aramaic, so the Levites became interpreters of a holy law written in an ancient and revered language. During this Second Temple period, we begin to see several developments that will become foundational to early Judaism. We see the elevation of the Torah and the study of the Torah to a religious and community-forging ritual. The role of the scribe is similarly elevated because scribes could read and copy this ancient and now authoritative text. Finally, the status of the Levites was raised because they made sense of the law for the people. They interpreted it in common language.
As fascinating as always. So let's summarize what we just covered. Persia came in and conquered Babylon, and the king of Persia, who was Cyrus, had a policy of sending back people who were conquered back to their homeland. The Bible tells us that God used Cyrus to send the Israelites back to Judah, to Jerusalem. The Cyrus cylinder confirms this policy of Cyrus's sending peoples back to their homelands. The Cyrus cylinder also talks about the Persian god, little g, Marduk, who Cyrus credits for him being able to conquer Babylon. Now, one of the things that we pointed out, and something that I like to think about when I read about all of these ancient gods, is the fact that even though these ancient peoples, all the other ancient peoples had their little g gods, God is the only one who is still around. And to me, that means a lot. First of all, it's fascinating that no other little g gods have lasted throughout the centuries, but God has. He was always there. He will always be here. He is the only one that's lasted and stood the test of time. We will continue to see that as we move through the 400 years of silence period that we're going to cover next. And as we continue to move into the New Testament, when the Greeks took over, and of course the Greeks had their gods, but you don't see them anymore. They're like all of the other little g gods are a part of ancient history, and God is the only one who is still here. Some of the Israelites came back. Some of them stayed in Babylon because they had assimilated there. The ones that stayed in Babylon, though, they supported the ones who were going back. When the exiles got back to Judah, they encountered peoples of the land. Okay, I'm going to stop doing this. When the exiles got back to Judah, they encountered what the Bible calls peoples of the land. Now, that could have been some of the Israelites that stayed in Judah and were not exiled. That could have been the people who were deported to Judah, because the Assyrians, when they were in control, they had a policy of conquering a territory and scattering their people. So they could have scattered some people from somewhere else down to Judah. It also could have been some of the Israelites from the north who didn't go into Assyrian captivity but fled south down to Judah. So they got back and they encountered these peoples of the land. And how are they going to handle dealing with these people of the land in their homeland? The first thing they wanted to do when they got back was to sacrifice. So they went to the Temple Mound and wanted to sacrifice there, but they were in a hurry because they were afraid of the people of the land. Now, I don't know why they were afraid of the people of the land. The next thing that they wanted to do was to begin to rebuild the temple. They started out with the altar because they wanted to be able to give sacrifices. The next thing they did was to lay the foundation. Now, in this process of rebuilding the temple, they had some Sanballats, aka haters. There were people there who were trying to frustrate the rebuilding of the temple, who were trying to confuse the people. They were angry that they were rebuilding the temple and fortifying, and so they were haters. If you look at Nehemiah chapter 2 and chapter 4, you will see that one of these people who were hating on the Israelites who had come back, his name was Sanballat. I told you guys that back in the day, I had some friends who would call each other Sanballats, and I had no idea what they were talking about. They were calling each other haters. It was all in good fun. But so if you want to call somebody a hater and them not know what you're talking about, just call them a Sanballat. So they had these issues with the people that were in the land. The foreigners that were in the land were an obstacle to the Israelites that had come back. And the Israelites that had come back were a threat to the foreigners who were in the land. Eventually, through Ezra and the governor Nehemiah, the people began to purify themselves from the peoples in the land. We all know that back in the day, the ancient Israelites were forbidden to intermarry. So Ezra and the governor Nehemiah, when they came back and found that the people had been mixing, the people who had been married to foreigners had to divorce their foreign spouses and put away their foreign children in order to purify the Israelite nation. While they're rebuilding the temple, they are also reestablishing the Torah as the law of the land. One of the ways that this happens is that Ezra gets the Torah and he reads it out loud, and all the people stand and signifying a reverence for the reading of the Torah. Also, what we learn is that most of the people that come back speaking the language Aramaic. The Torah is written in Hebrew. So the Levites end up being translators of the Torah from the Hebrew language to Aramaic, which is the language that the people now speak because they were captive in Babylon, and Aramaic was the language of Babylon. The next lecture is going to be about Israel's their quest for their national identity. So they're back home, they're surrounded by all of these different groups, these different people. There are different people that are in their land. How do they express their national identity amongst all of these different people? Okay, that's going to be our next lecture. In our final class, we're going to do one huge recap of the entire Old Testament. No, that's way too much. We're going to do a little bitty recap of the entire Old Testament. We're just going to hit the main points just so that we have a recap and a better picture before we move into our next series. I'm so excited about this next series. I'm excited about all of it. Y'all, I stay excited. I stay excited. But I'm excited about our next series because we're going to do that 400-year in-between period, the silent years that they call it. I think the way we're going to do it a little bit differently. So we're going to do it in more of a storytelling type of format. It's not going to be the video that we watch and then my commentary. It's going to be more like a storytelling type of thing. And I am really excited about that. Of course, then after that, we move into the New Testament. Oh God, there's so much. There's so much. And then we're going to travel through the New Testament. Once we do that, then we're going to get into like the everyday type stuff. So let me know what you think about the storytelling method as opposed to the video method. I have not found a good video series on the 400 years middle period, but I do. I have an outline of the 400-year middle period, and so I kind of, let me just stop because I'm doing it. Let me know if you have any questions about this particular class or what we've covered so far. If you have any questions on where we're going, where this is progressing, let me know. Leave those in the comments or shoot me an email. Please like the video and subscribe to our channel. Please share the video if you think that you have someone who would be interested in joining the class. I really appreciate you guys, and I will see you next week. We are almost done with the Old Testament. I'm so excited. See you next week.